Here we go. So this week we're going to talk about primer sessions. Essentially, what is a primer, and what are each approaches to how we program a primer, how it might look for each of us, and how we might associate that with the rest of our program. So we've gone through some of the things already. I've already sent some content to some of you guys to have a look at, to have a read over, and I want to get some thoughts on how does it fit with your modality of coaching. Does anyone want to kick this off with some of the notes that I'd asked them to write? No?
I'll go. So basic understanding from like material that I've read and my experience with coaching and programming has been that my primer will set them up for what I want to be essentially their primary day, or you know, their main focus of work or something like that. So my preferred method would be something like a movement constraint or a variation or something like that. So a very, very simple principle, and then working on the basis of how far apart do I want that to be from their primary day, because I want it to maintain the skill and things like that, but I also don't want it to become super fatiguing or something like that. So in sort of essence, that is my overview of my experience with using a primer day or a variation to prime for a primary day.
And do you always use a variation to some degree, or have you ever like used just like, if we're talking about squats, do you always use like pull squats, tempo squats, a belt squat, or is it just squats? Like, what have you?
I have actually sometimes run like a variation that's gone really, really well. And then I've actually thought to myself, what would happen if I just programmed 2 squat days? And that's also gone really, really well, because I try to think of it along the lines of why not rather than why. So I'm just like, this is going really, really well. So if the exposure to a variation works well, why would not the exposure to the something more specific work really well as well? So yes, I have done both.
Nice. But what was the reason for the primer? So we could talk about primers, and it can be a secondary day, it can be a third day, it can be a fourth day, for example, like the bench press. What's your main reason to apply it, or what is your thought process? Right, I need this primer day, whatever it might be.
I think there's a couple elements here. So what does the lifter need? Is it skill preparation? Is it a strength development or fatigue? So we need to ultimately define what does the lifter need. So whether it's a confidence thing, maybe sticking in a session in between your primary and your second, or your secondary and your primary, whatever the case may be, we want to support that confidence. So whether it's just getting under the bar, just giving a little bit of confidence on that day, or if it's a skill application, maybe like Shell said, we'll use a variation. If they rush into the hole, we could use a tempo squat, for example, to reinforce that and bring that into the primary day.
Sound. So let's say if we're going to talk about squats now, and let's say we have an athlete who's doing 3 days a week, would you not focus more on the variation on the secondary day? That's what you add in, for example.
Focus more on the secondary day as a variation day.
And then let's say if we had an athlete who needed a third day, like how would you potentially set it all out?
So I don't think we actually have to go with a priming day, especially if you're new to lifting or new to powerlifting. We need to kind of establish what is going wrong within your training first before we then apply a primary day. So generally speaking, we can run a primary day as a specific comp movement. Your secondary day could be a variation to support that primary, and your tertiary could just be additional volume to stimulate hypertrophy or something.
Yeah, I always look at it as what's the needs of the primary day? Can we get all of that from a secondary day, or is it a case of if they need more volume but we just can't give it to them on that secondary, then we obviously add it into the primary? I've I've fallen into the trap of giving too much variation. So this is just my own experience now, where I'm coming away from that a little bit. Say I do give them, like, if they need some extra skill, I'll work on that skill aspect primarily on the secondary day, and then on that primer day, on that third day, I will just give them, like, if it's squats that we're talking about, I will just give them an extra squat day. Depending on what they need on that squat day is obviously going to depend on the lifter, but I always base it on what is it that we need for that primary to thrive at its best.
I think a lot of the questions with the primary, like, so with the primer session, so the idea being, like, what the proximity has to be to the primary session we're actually trying to get out of it. Is it a session that you need directly the day before? When you're talking about someone who's squatting 2 times a week, is the secondary day, does it need to prime your day 1, for instance? So let's say that your day 2 squats are on, your secondary squats are on day 3, and then your primary squats on day 1. Do you need those to be closer together to be able to prime the day 1, or do they even need to prime it? The assumption of a primer is that you're trying to maintain or increase the technical level going into that session. That's normally what primers applied for, right? So if you go into day 1, they're strongest, but the skill capacity is not there. Are we then suggesting, well, you need an additional squat day that's closer, so potentially on day 5, that closes that gap, bridges the skill breakdown over time, and means they can perform better on day 1? Well, the question then becomes, like, rather than a primer, do we just move their secondary squats closer, so further away in between, but obviously on the back end closer together? And so I don't think primer is always the way forwards, but it's an option, because when you add that, as you say, you add the tertiary squat session, and you're like, okay, well, now day 1's performing better on skill, but actually by proxy of bias, you probably end up giving more volume, and you end up deteriorating the long term of it regardless. So I think a primer is a good concept to apply, but it can often almost get carried away of being like, more often is better because skill is better, but then more often means more volume and more fatigue. And this is what me and Alex spoke about before, is that I think in the podcast that we were listening to on this, there was a version on demonizing of fatigue, that there's the anti-demonizing of fatigue, being like, fatigue's not a bad thing. I think for the athlete, that's true. They should probably be like, fatigue doesn't matter too much. I can be mindful that I'm still in a good condition. But as a coach, you do have to be more mindful of the potential impact of adding more sessions just for the sake of potentially increasing technical prowess in that primary day.
So to add to that, so why would you, or where would you move rather than add?
I think this is demonstration on the primary day, right? So are we sticking to squat to make this as like, squat's probably the easiest one in the middle. Bench is the easiest, but we'll go to squat. So let's just say that it's just a case that both are performing to a good degree. Strength is good where it's supposed to be. The secondary day, whether that's a variation and we're trying to correct something and that is working, and the primary day strength progression is working, but the skill's deteriorating, you might just look to close the gap to allow performance. One of the ways that this is more notably common, and Adam, you might even see this in your training, is where the secondary day almost gets too good. And you're like, this is doing too well off the back of it. And actually this is becoming stronger because of the space between them. So it might be a case that you shift the time frame to better allow one to do better off the back of it. And so I think the shift is just a question of whether or not those sessions are enough of their own right. And then when you start splitting up a squat, like if we gave you squats 4 times a week, you'd be fucking great at squats, but you would probably start getting a bit too beaten up. And so you just start weighing up the potential impact of it.
I think we can kind of diverge into what kind of lifter it is, because as we discussed on a call on a previous week, if you've got someone squatting 400, what is their capacity to then add additional days in? Or if you close the gap too close, then that's going to have more of an impact into their primary. So it's kind of a niche problem there, but
it is. But I think one of the things that's important with this is what we're defining as priming. So let's just say, for instance, you've got someone who squats on their day 1, then they deadlift, and then they squat again. Is there something within a deadlift session that can prime the squat just by its nature? So like if it's someone that would benefit from, whether it's their accessories move slightly less proximal to hinging work and there's a little bit more knee bend work somewhere relevant in there, does that constitute as priming? Because I think like most people see priming as the movement and it being really proximal to it. But I think in the examples, there were accessories to it. But I think there's even more examples. Like I know it was in the conversation last week, a priming tempo bench or a top set of bench is still priming. And so I think there's like, in those examples, there's just more nuance to how you might approach it, as opposed to it looking quite so simplistic of just another squat session.
Oh,
Yeah, and
so I was just going to add and say I completely agree. Like, and the podcast did discuss that as well, and say it doesn't have to be a squat. Can it be a movement that is less taxing and that is less demanding, that still trains the movement pattern and the skill and allows you to work hard, but doesn't have that fatigue carryover that will bring the skill closer together without it necessarily being a squat day?
sometimes it, like, from my experience, I've had to do this a couple of times now. Sometimes it's not just skill, but it's more a case of just feeling good going into a day. So I've had about 2 or 3 guys for like a primer day. I've had them do dumbbell bench press just to get a little bit of blood and a little bit of pump into the pecs. And they always feel better going into their primary day. They might be carrying a little bit of fatigue going into their primary, but they feel good for it. Whereas we've tried to do barbell on that, they're like just a normal barbell bench, different types of variations, and it just didn't work. Like they didn't get that same stimulus, they didn't get that same pump. So utilizing some forms of like non-specific work can really help as well, if they just need to do a little bit more in the area that they are utilizing.
I think like if you take something a bit more extreme divergence of it, of like, let's say you've got someone hitting a primary deadlift, if they were to do core work the day before, would that be considered priming if it's relevant skill? And like I understand that, like, not to completely bastardize what primer means, like to simplify, primer should be you are doing something to prepare someone to do the main thing they're going to do. But I think there's a lot of caveats to what that can potentially be. Of like, if I give someone a weighted plank, the next day they have a deadlift, I'm like, okay, maybe there's fatigue of the midsection or the core muscles to some degree, but are they more aware of that musculature? Does that apply better the day after? So maybe priming doesn't have to be considered so straightforward.
I also think as well. Sorry, Lucy, you go.
Sorry. Why do we not put the primer on day 1 to prep for then your primary session later on in the week? Why are we using a primary session on day 1 and then priming later on like say day 3 or even day 5?
I don't think we are. So like people do, but so for instance, if you take Alice's program, which we spoke about earlier, day 1 you have 3x4,
4x3, just pause bench press,
straightforward bench press, and day 2 is your primary bench day, right? Your primer day is on day 1, but typically this is where we're saying like primary is probably a primer is almost an over assumption of what people need. Is typically on the beginning of the week people are stronger anyway, and the skill is relevant enough that they can maintain it, so you don't need a primer. And so I think more often it's just weighing out whether like if they're just already strong and this is where they perform the best, fuck a primer. The proximity to the end of the last week's probably enough.
And
I think that also depends where their risk might be as well. Like if they're
Alex, again, it cut out while you're talking.
Oh, sorry. I feel like it might be dependent on where their rest days are as well. So it said in the podcast about it being like 48 hours. So if you do the primer day in day 1 and then only a couple of days later, are they still going to be tired from their primer day? I guess it depends how much you're pushing the primer day. But I made some notes about how, like, I've got clients whose sessions, they change throughout the week, they work shifts, and it can be really difficult to choose where to put a primer day based on when they might be training. So yeah, I don't know on like the time in between the primer day and the normal day, whether like how much that has a bigger impact. And that's why I think most people have their like 1 or 2 rest days at the end of the week, and then they go into their primary day fresh. So I'm guessing that's why we would do primer days towards the end of the week, so we're well rested for our primary days.
It's really hard to say those 2 words back to back, isn't it?
And primary, yeah.
I think that's the one that I was really interested in. Is they said 48 to 6 hours.
6 hours to 48 hours.
We'll argue the 6 separately, but the like really what distance is priming? Like how long does that skill acquisition maintain for, whether it's psychological or physical? Like I'm not sure I agree with 48 being a cap.
Yeah, I don't think it needs to be. Some people have days rest.
I think it kind of boils down to how skillful a lifter is as well.
Like, so a good example, like typically you'll see someone with a pause deadlift, let's say it's on a Friday, and they deadlift again, let's say Wednesday. I would still consider those potential carryover, either psychologically or physically. And that's a lot more than 48 hours. Don't ask me to do the maths. I have no idea. It's 4,000 hours, I think. I think it's 4,000 hours.
There was a principle that they also discussed that I think, sorry, Lucy, that feels really relevant here as well when it talks about like fatigue and sort of assessing fatigue and like how long should we be having a gap. And that was do you feel fresh and weak, fresh and strong, fatigued and weak, or fatigued and strong? And as Callum was saying, we always see fatigue as sort of like a negative thing, when in actual fact, it can be used as a positive as well, like, you know, feeling a little bit fatigued, and they explained it as feeling kind of, you know, full and ready to work. And I went in my session today feeling quite fatigued, and my old expectation would have been like, this session is going to be bad because I'm tired. It was an incredible session. It was a really, really good session. So now my instinct is that when I actually feel slightly fatigued, I know I'm going to have a good session. So I never really understood that until I listened to the podcast. And when they said that, I was just like, that makes so much sense. When I go in feeling fresh, I normally don't have a very good session. And it's really, really strange, like just trying to wrap my head around that. And I actually took an additional day because I did not feel ready to squat yesterday. I was not, and it was the correct call to move my training over by a day. I still felt slightly fatigued, but it was the right level of fatigue for me. So getting to understand that kind of principle is also very interesting. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that brings us to the concept of like feeling detrained and such, which is one of the reasons why I would put a primer session in, or some primer sets in that I might not want to increase their like bench frequency too much, but I want to put something in there so they don't have huge gaps in their week where they're not benching. So yeah, you don't want them to be detrained, which is like a good reason to use a primer session.
I think the good example of that, as we actually talked about last week, is using like a spoto bench. Like we want to keep the frequency, we want to keep the skill, but if we feel like they're going to over fatigue, just sticking like a spoto in the middle is good to bridge the gap, but also maintain as like a primer, for example.
Ryan, do you mind asking, when you program something like a dumbbell bench, so in terms of priming, one of the things I do very little is use an accessory quite so direct to prime, right? So let's say that you're taking dumbbell bench 2 days or a day prior to having your primary bench day. Would you what sort of intensity or volume are you programming at?
Like typically it's something like a 2x8, like an RP 6 to a 7. So nothing drastic, no great amount of volume. It's enough to get a pump, like what I call a pump, but not enough to create.
Have you coined this term, a pump? I've never heard this before. What Ryan calls a pump.
I use it a lot when I'm talking to guys. But it was essentially there because we knew that we needed a third day of pressing. But the two issues that I came into with the guys that I had was because their arches weren't great, they're slightly older, they would always have problems with their shoulders. So we had to almost come away from the bench press to mitigate that, but we knew we needed something else. One of them started with press ups, went really well, so we moved them onto some chest press, and again worked really well, and we're still using that. And then the other one, I just put them on chest press, dumbbell bench press, and it just seems, again, the indicator day, the primary day, seems to be flourishing from that. When posing them questions, they're feeling really good coming into the day. Very much like you, Cheryl, they feel a little bit like, oh, I've done something here, but I feel ready to go. And we've had that from block to block.
I think one of the best things about the accessory end is that even if let's just say that they overshot whatever intensity program, the realistic level of fatigue they're going to cause is pretty low. Like you throw 40 rounds, but you can bench 125. And so that kind of caps it, because one of the things I found that I've always, as an athlete, I get wrong, and I'm self-coached, so I make fucking terrible decisions. My primer session is, I think it's a 2x6 on just pause bench, and it's programmed at like fuck all intensity. But then the intent of like, oh, but linear progression, I did 110 last week, I could do 112. and then I just slowly push it to a point. This primer session is actually now just derailing the primary session. Whereas if you use an accessory, you almost cap the ability for that to happen. Lucy's expression tells me this fucker's doing it too.
Yeah, that's exactly what I do.
You had Larson as primer work before, I think. And then you just try to put that every week too.
I think so depending on, like we discussed at the start, depending on whether you're trying to reduce fatigue or trying to improve a skill would depend on which one I would choose. So like going into comp, I was doing tempo, close grip, and then normal comp pause is 3x6, like a 5, and that was my primer into my comp bench. But when I'm like not prepping for comp, that becomes a squatto. So my primer is a squatto to reduce the fatigue. So I think the using a primer is the easiest on bench by far. But would you ever, this seems like quite a rogue question, but would you ever program a squat, deadlift with bench wherever you needed it to be in between? But then you, like, your day one is like a primer to your squat, then you've got a primer deadlift day into your peak deadlift, which would be on day 4. Is that something you would ever use?
I love the theoretical. I'm gonna let someone else answer.
Can you just say again? Sorry, day 1 is what? Primer squat.
Squat, deadlift.
Oh, okay, so literally back to backing.
Kum opened his mouth to talk, so I want Kum to answer why it's absolutely. He made his mouth move. So yeah, I feel his frozen. So
I'd say no, just because it's fairly taxing, and I was gonna flip this whole topic on its head with my question, but I'll answer Lucy's first. So I'm gonna go with no, just because one, I think deadlift is already taxing on its own. So I think having 2 back-to-back deadlifts is gonna ruin the primary day. And then same with squat, especially if it's low bar. I think if you go high bar, low bar, you could get away with it a little bit, but I don't think it would be beneficial if we do back-to-back.
What's the reason for the question, Lucy? Is there a reason or methodology to this, or was it just?
She's banned for shit and she asked the crazy question. Isn't it? It's not. There's no reason.
In my head, I'm like, you should prime for something and then you should execute it. So in my head, I'm like, prime on day 1, squat say day 3, prime for deadlifts maybe day 4, and then deadlift day 6, and then you've still got that day 7 to recover into your primer squat day 1. Repeat. In my head, I'm like, that might work.
The logic the principle logic makes sense, but the problem with the pathology risk, like what actually would happen to someone who went to do something low enough intensity that it wouldn't impact the day after would mean that the carryover would be very minimal and the total workload of the squat would become so small because you can't do something at a late point in the week. And then by the time you've done something for a squat twice in a row and you come to priming your deadlift, not only are you fatigued and it has to be low weight. If you're going to pull, let's say 180 for a triple on Friday, Thursday to prime it, you'd be like 120 tops. Let's not fuck around. I'll be too tired. And so you're not actually getting a constructive secondary day of deadlift. So in principle, yes, you would on your first week have great squat and DBD deadlift, and then week on week you would grow. Done. Come, what was the question that turned everything on its head?
Maybe it won't, but going back to what you said earlier about shifting schedules, why can't we just do that instead of adding in another day? Say like the athlete's constricted on schedules and stuff like that. Or if we're worried about fatigue or skill, why can't we just either space it out or bring it closer together to have it carry over?
So,
Right.
Yeah, I'll answer this. So that would be my first port of call. Is can I get whatever I need for that indicator day or that primary day? Can I get it from what I've got right now if I shift around my days? Like that's how I would look at most of my programs or most of my athletes first and foremost. Then if I go, right, if they need more skill and I cannot get enough of that from the secondary day, even after I've moved the proximity about, that's when I would then look at, okay, if I was to add in a primary day, a primer day, where would I slot it in and how would that look? and then I would play around with it then. So it would be the days that I would switch on first, and then I would look at adding in an extra day.
And then from there, how do you determine if it's intent or a skill thing? Is the athlete coming in without intent of like their focus points, or is it just truly a skill thing?
I think it's more focused questions to the athletes to get a specific response. Like, how does the bar feel on your back? How does it feel in your legs? If it's a skill thing, then you can physically see from our check-in videos. From the 2 days a week that we're doing, regardless of us flipping around our days, your hips are still kicking back from underneath you. I'm giving you a decent amount of dosage of volume. It might just mean that we need a third skilled full day. Could be a pull squat or a tempo squat, whatever it might be, on that primer day to lead us into the primary. So it's directed questions that I would go to the athlete, like, how are you feeling? How are you feeling coming into the primary? What's it telling us? How's our numbers moving? And then, yeah, base it off of that.
I think one of the things we were saying before about like training age is a really relevant point here, because a beginner, the novelty of doing something more frequently than having not done it is already priming it by nature. And so I think it then becomes like degree of training age, and then the way you would gauge it as a difference, not only of, as you said, like the weighted questions that obviously give a better answer, is the consistency of the fault happening with relevant changes having been made. Like, it's the last port of call to add more frequency. You're not first. You're like, we haven't played with the intensity, the rep ranges, whatever it may well be, the variants that are going to apply at the accessories. So they're still going to be your starting points. But if you're like, well, we've been doing pause deadlift days and you're still kicking your hips really early, and we've tried like reinforcing something like high bar to get a better quad engagement off the floor, like a thing, whatever, and it's still happening, we're like, if the skill's just derailing that quickly, maybe we just give something really low dosage and just see what happens, and you just shift one of your working sets somewhere. But it's a very late decision. It's probably not something that would come up unless you've got a lot of other low-hanging fruit has been picked first. I thought there'd be more to that.
I was actually just interested to ask if like who's programmed a third squat day, and like where did you put that in, and what was the decision behind that? Because like it's something I have thought about, but I also feel like it is an extreme, and it was something I would do incredibly low dose at first, just to see what the response is and see if I should increase it from there.
Who else has other than me, so I don't just steal the conversation? Right, you go.
So I've got two examples. One is a lighter female who can't handle a lot of volume within one given session. So she's actually quite skilled as a squatter, but she can't handle a huge amount of doses of volume within that one session. And because of that, when she comes into a primary, she is feeling really, really flat. So I've given her a primer day on, so say secondary day, secondary day is Monday, primer day is on a Wednesday, and then a primary day is on the Friday. So we'll just do a single at an RP 6 to 7 variation, which can be quite hard, but she handles it quite well, which sets her up for her primary day on Friday. Then the other way that I've gone about it is with one of my slightly older athletes, Tom. I say slightly old, he's only 25. But we've given him belt squats a day before his primary squats, just to keep his knees moving, because he gets really clunky knees. So he has very low amount of volume, low amount of intensity on the day before his primary squats, just to get his knees moving.
There's something we did as well, Callum, introducing a third squat day, more of a confidence with my knees, because they tend to stay out of the equation, and I tend to stay away from loading my quads. So with this block, we introduced, was a high bar on day 4, and obviously then my day 1, so day 4 would land on a Friday, day 1 would land on a Monday. And kind of the hope is that I trust my quad more, and that was kind of the key principle of it.
So I one of the things we talk about is when we do this a lot is we'll talk about the things we've done that are successful. I've also done this and fucked up training. The good thing is it was mine. So I did the same principle. I did exactly what we did with Adam, but I did it with myself first, which is why I was comfortable programming for you afterwards. I brought in high bar for on my day 5 on the hope that I would come to my day 1 with a slightly closer proximity and I would stay in my quads more. I was like, it's the biggest failure of my squat, early knee extension, whatever. And in the initial weeks, I did 60 kilos. I think it got to 100 kilos, and it was incredibly conservative, the sub 50% of any of my maxes. And it was like beltless, effortless. And I was going into my primary squat day, I could feel my quads still more, like that slight pump effect. Great principle. And it was good. And then I'm a fucking idiot. And I just kept going and being like, well, it's still a sub 5. So 140 is a sub 5, 150 is a sub 5, same volume. And then slowly going into my primary session, all I found was my legs really fucking hurt. And I actually couldn't stay in my legs worse than before. And I think this is the fundamental thing that always with a primer, I'm going to say something objective that could be completely false, which is they should almost always be linearly fixed. There should be no change. Whereas like if it's primer for a principle, it should not have a linear progression over time. So if it's that, and it's the reason I was comfortable programming for Adam is because I don't mind being a dick to Adam, being like, take the weight off the bar, I don't care. But for myself, the absolute arrogance was more weight, better, more squatting. This will only go well. And it just derailed my training. So I have done it. The high bar is the one I play with the most because it's the most load capping for people that they don't fuck around with it because I don't want to do it anyway. I think I have Amelia week 1, she did it at 70 kilos, again, sub 50%. And yeah, so I think the principle of it was a really good one and it was the right thing to carry over, but it's just being very cautious of what that load progression could look like.
So if we have that primer session, like you said, and sort of like you're tempted to say like it's fixed, is that what you said? Like you keep it where it is, so we can't sort of like take the piss with it essentially. At what point would you want to change that, or how would you then sort of assess the the feedback and the analysis from that? Because you can't run it static forever. Does that make sense? Or like what would your approach to that be?
So like say for instance that on the first week, let's just use it as bench because this is easier and I like bench, is that if the day before your primary day it was like a 2x6 and it's 100 kilos, and then like for the whole block you're like take it at 100 kilos. I think depending on the relative strength progression, so let's say that my bench goes from 150 to 160, I might make an adequate equal allowance where it's like it's increased by 3%, I'll allow the primer to increase by 3%. Past that, I would still probably cap it by relative intensity of being like more towards the RIR of being like around 6 in the fucking tank, 4 on RPE, and being like harsher to that, being like it fucking lives there, and that weight can fluctuate up and down. It's only when I start to see like if something's happening in the primary day unexpected and that primer has been programmed wrong, then it's harder to distinguish. But if you program that primary day, which is what it should be, on the minimal effective dose, like it should be the, like you said, the 2x8 on a dumbbell press, which is fuck all. But like if I gave you a 3x7, I'm like, well, the 7's too much. Was the 3 of the sets too much? Was the RP6 too much? Like too many variables to play with. So if you put the primary in with minimal variable, I think it's easiest to distinguish the impact.
And just sorry, like one more on that, like, and before you then sort of looked at that and be like, it's not giving me any kind of return, would you sort of toggle that, like you said, just to be like, because like to find the minimal effective dose, have we completely undershot it? Like we're going to know if we've overcooked it, because we're just, yeah, that's going to be slightly more obvious. But would you sort of like have a little play with those, like the minimal variables, to just be like, maybe I've undercooked it slightly?
Yeah, I think there's kind of a top end assumption to it of like what that total volume is going to look like. Like I haven't found anything north of like 18 working reps to be productive on a bench. South of that's pretty sound. But the like a single set I find doesn't do enough. 2 sets should be enough on a load that they have to warm up to, because that's important as well. If it's a load they don't have to warm up to, there's actually not enough skill practice within that time frame for those 2 sets to be relevant. Adam, you're doing so much thinking. It's actually, I really want to know.
No, because the principle of a primer, we're all basing on separate days, but some of the principles still align with some of the stuff I do with my athletes, but on the same day.
I spoke about earlier.
So like my RDL, I run that with people that find or have trouble with hinging in the deadlift and midfoot pressure. I would run an RDL or prior to their deadlift on the exact same day, so it's acting as a primer and a corrective movement. but we're always sort of assuming that a primary is on a different day.
But that's assuming it's a skill orientated thing that we're looking at. Because if we're coming into then thinking, like, say for example, the barbell feels heavy on my back, you can't just give them more top end stuff on that primary day. Does that make sense? So where I do agree with that skill orientation, because this is something we've spoken about before. If you've got an athlete who's like, I'm coming into my primary day and I feel heavy as shit, I can't move this, I don't feel great, then that's kind of where the other primary day comes into it, if it's needed at all. But I think that's very assumption based on skill orientated.
Everyone goes into a deep dive of thought again.
Mm.
What the only thing that, like, because we don't have to talk about this one all day because it's a good subject, and actually Alice pointed out in terms of resource, the podcast you sent, and then there's fuck all else. So this actually might be something people actually watch, God forbid. So we won't drag it out. The only thing I was going to add is that this is very sport relevant in our conversation, and me and Alice spoke about this at length. Of if you were doing CrossFit, that proximal time frame, that 6 hours, starts to become a relevant conversation, which we won't get into too much, but it's so interesting of being like, if you were someone who does do something like sessions twice a day, there's so much more to be said of what you could do in the morning. And the only person in the sport doing something really interesting with this is like Agatha. Yeah, like I would love to see someone. Oh, go on, who are you gonna say?
I would argue Sean Noriega as well.
Oh, Sean's insane. Yeah, Sean's a great one. Do you remember on his comp day, he was in the warm-up room, not this one, his last comp, he was in the warm-up room benching because he has a primer bench session the same day as his bench session.
Yes.
And in principle, I fully get that. And I'm like, that would be so interesting if right now, as like, okay, tomorrow I'm training at 1. And so in the morning I get up and I just do bench with the bar for a bit. I'm like, yeah, the load's verging on irrelevant, but it's not irrelevant. And so I wonder what the carryover difference would be. I think that's a conversation that doesn't exist in powerlifting. I'd fucking love to see. I'd just love to see it tested. I'll do it.
Yeah. Because he's going into his most recent comp, which is PA Nats. I think it's PA Nats. He done 3-day a week deadlift, which was
Really?
which is very interesting to see. And
He
felt his last. And that primer deadlift day that he had was for his grip, not like nothing else.
What was he running?
I honestly don't know. I was just watching his because he put out a YouTube video on his overview of his comp. So because I like his program is very interesting. So I just wanted to see like how did he run into it, and he just said that he done 3 days a week. So
because to bastardize the term even further, is a taper week just not a series of primers? You know, like just for the intrigue's sake of being like that's the principle you're applying, but I'm just going to make it even harder to convey.
I have a question about, so you mentioned that he runs his 3rd deadlift day for grip, right?
Yeah.
But there's so many other things you could do that would alleviate fatigue directly for the deadlift, but still
Spend the day like this.
But that's kind of the question I have with that bit.
Well, I think in his specific case, he is very gifted with his positioning. To the point to where if he had a 3rd deadlift day, it wouldn't hit him.
Yeah.
Like you look at how he squats and then look at how he deadlifts. Like that's just a natural position for him. So I don't think on that 3rd day is that fatiguing for him as a standalone sort of person.
I could understand it more if it was more skill related with that grip.
It might be. I don't know the ins and outs. I just found it quite interesting.
I really want to see what that is because it'd be interesting if it's like when he's training grip, as in he is training resetting his hook, or if it's he's training grip because he's training the feeling of a certain load for a certain time frame, whatever. Because one seems inherently fatiguing and one seems inherently boring shit. But it'd be really interesting to see what he does. Did anyone else who's not me, Adam, Cheryl or Ryan, who did most of the talking, want to weigh in anything additional?
They said about a arm day as a primer for a bench day, and I was like, that sounds stupid, but he said it works. But I thought of the question of as the RPEs start to climb, like how is that arm day going to affect? I don't know whether there's like an element of bodybuilding with this particular athlete that he was talking about, but I was just like, that's ridiculous. What is other people's thoughts on that?
So they might be running it as static, as we've discussed, but then, as Ryan mentioned earlier, it might be running on the principle that they just feel good.
Yeah, but imagine like how you're gonna have to in-block taper that. So you go in, you do the rope extensions with like 2.5 kilos to maintain it. Like I don't. The arm day thing's an obscure one, and also when we're talking about like where you would start, all these variables, that's the last fucking thing I would pick. Like, and maybe I'm blindingly wrong, and they are right, but who the fuck is going? You know what we should do? Curls and tricep extensions before you bench on Monday.
Do you think that's a very, I hope you don't hate me for saying this, a very Americanized take on it? Because you see lots of American powerlifters do.
Jack, I hate you.
What was that?
I said that.
I hate you.
Oh yeah, come fuck this guy.
Love you. But you do see a lot of American powerlifters take arm days in this fashion. Again, I'm on the concept of I don't necessarily see the point, but
I'll say none of us here have jacked arms, so maybe we're wrong.
no, I got media.
How dare you, firstly?
I coach you. I just think it's such a weird place to start, like to end up. Or imagine doing it in reverse, being like, we tried bench, didn't work. So we tried dumbbell bench, but it didn't work. So we tried cable fly, it didn't work. So now we're on tricep extensions. We're gonna do lateral raises next week. Like how far down the chain do you have to get?
I feel like
I kind of get the reason behind it.
So again,
I feel like I kind of get the reason behind it, but like it'd be the last thing I'd go to.
yeah.
It could probably fall under like the same principle of like programming dumbbell presses, because you're still using your triceps in a bench press, not the biceps. I don't know how that falls into line, but I feel like it could probably follow that same principle, but it just wouldn't be the first thing that I think of.
Are we happy wrapping up there? We've chatted about this for fucking ages. Wonderful. I'll stop. Wait, how do I stop the recording? I forgot. Okay, it's been a while. Okay, done.